It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. Charles Dickens certainly knew how to open a story of the French Revolution in his Tale of Two Cities. That sort of helps me put perspective on these times that we live in today. This past August, and it seems to be going through this September, has presented us with some of the worst times in both of our politics and in our church. It is during these days that I truly believe that one needs to involve oneself in a study of history. In a homily I gave a few weeks ago, I quoted the historian John Meacham's new book, The Soul of America, The Battle for Our Better Selves. And Meacham puts these chaotic political days in perspective with many accounts of troubling times in our past that were just as chaotic, and yet our better angels prevailed. I believe that we must do the same with the crisis in our church today. If you have a sense of history, you realize that we've been mired in scandal many times since Jesus walked this earth. His message has sustained us and has won out through all the human messes that our very imperfect and flawed institution has created. And it's times like this that I go to history and I go to literature. Graham Greene comes to mind with his story of the whiskey priest in The Power and the Glory. Greene was, of course, considered one of the great Catholic authors, even though he did not want that title. He had a love-hate relationship with the church. He made a distinction between belief and faith. He understood the imperfections, the flaws, the sins of the institution. In an interview that he gave, he talked about the abuses of the church in Mexico in the 1930s, when the church became so intertwined with politics that the result was tremendous persecution. And Greene, in that interview, stated that the church should be grateful for those persecutions because the church was purged and then it became healthy. The church has failed many times throughout history, and yet the Spirit has continued to carry us through. Well, the church has once again failed us. The leaders of our church have failed us. And as Greene wrote about the issues in Mexico in the 30s, the church was purged because of the persecutions. Health resulted. The same has to happen today. The grand jury report from Pennsylvania does not give us new information. It gives us a ton of the same information at once that is sordid and ugly and frankly evil. It speaks to us of betrayal. It tells us that even though much was done after the Boston debacle in 2000, there is still so much more yet to be done. In Dallas in 2000, the bishops dealt with the priests, but they did not hold themselves accountable. It is now way beyond time that the bishops must hold themselves accountable. In last Sunday's Wall Street Journal, George Weigel wrote a piece called Crisis, but Not Faith. He makes that same distinction that Graham Greene makes. He writes, Catholics must not let the seemingly endless sexual abuse scandals overshadow their trust in the message of Christ. And he goes on to say the church is being called to a great purification. He says leaders who are guilty have put institutional maintenance ahead of evangelical mission. And those Catholics who have been stirred to protest but have not been shaken in their faith are those who will effect the reform the church needs. And then a couple of days ago, Arthur Brooks wrote a very challenging piece in the New York Times, comparing the betrayal by the clergy to the betrayal of a spouse. He says, when people are betrayed, they begin to question everything. And then he says, if some priests and bishops don't believe the church's most obvious teachings on pastoral care and sexual morality, what else do they not believe? Do they think the Gospels are false? What a painful question for any of you to have to ask. The bishops since 2000 have put in structures to stop the abuse, to stop the cover-ups. It's certainly not enough. The recent grand jury report stirs the church to now do the basic structural reform that's needed. We need to face the systemic issues. We need to ask the serious questions about power, about clericalism in the church that created this mess. We need to look at forced celibacy. We need to look at giving more power to laity, to yourselves, and to especially women. This is the kind of cleansing and purification that is needed, and unfortunately will only come about because of the rage and the disgust felt by you, the body of Christ. These are difficult and painful times. The cover-ups must end. The victims must all be heard and cared for pastorally. And from the top down, the difficult questions must be faced. Both in the political world of Washington and the church world of Catholicism, we are living in challenging and history-making times. Future generations will look back on us and reflect upon whether our leaders had the moral courage to do what is right and just. We must be historians. We must see the big picture. We must realize, you must realize, that the church belongs not to the clergy, but it is your church. Vatican II emphasized, you are the body of Christ. Now, you may be tempted to leave and quit. I don't think that's the answer. Stay and demand change. Stay and get involved. Stay and ask the tough questions. Stay and demand accountability. There's a very hopeful article in the National Catholic Reporter this week telling us that younger Catholics are seeing this moment as a call to action, that they are inspired by Vatican II ecclesiology, and they're planning to stay and fight for reform of the power structures that allowed the abuse to happen and that protected church leaders who tried to cover it up. Our bishop has written all of us a letter that's in the Catholic Sun, it's on the websites. He writes of the evil of this abuse, and he calls us to prayer and penance next weekend. Prayer and penance, of course, are very important. but we have to go so much further. Real change has to happen. Apologies and remorse are certainly no longer the answer. Last week was filled with coverage of John McCain's funeral. I was very inspired by the letter that he wrote, his last letter to the American people. And he wrote, "Do not despair of our present difficulties, but believe always in the promise and the greatness of America, because nothing is inevitable here. Americans never quit. We never surrender. We never hide from history. We make history." Well, I believe in the soul of the Catholic faithful, in the soul of all of you present here this morning, that we do not despair, we do not quit, we do not surrender, we do not hide from history, we make history. So let us make history by forcing the change needed in the church that all of us love so very much. Please clap for yourselves for hanging in there, and let us recite the Apostles' Creed.